Welcome to the Upfront Podcast with me, your host, Nina Mueller, where you'll get your weekly dose of upfront discussions with people from all around the world. On today's episode, I will be speaking with Dr. Eyal Dujovny, an environmental anthropologist who has lived in many different countries and now works as a licensed tour guide in Israel. We will discuss his fascinating career, what his experience with various travel groups and cultures have been like, and his opinion on the Middle East conflict. Hi, Eyal. How are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm perfect. Thank you so much. It's great to have you on this week's episode.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. So let's jump right in. So you were born in Israel, right? And then you grew up in the US mainly. You then lived in several countries. Can you tell me more about that and how that came to be?
Yeah, so I was born in Israel, and when I was 4 years old, my parents moved to the United States, and I spent most of my life in the US. I grew up there. My father was a doctor, and he got a job there. My mother was Israeli, and my father's from Argentina. So I kind of
Mm.
had a multicultural background to begin with. And then I was kind of between US, Israel, and Argentina a lot. And I decided to live in Israel for my undergrad. And then I went back to the States. I lived in India for a couple years. I lived in Switzerland. I lived in Lithuania. I lived in Spain. So I've been around. I've been to a bunch of places, and I've always loved learning and about different cultures and meeting people from different places. So I really enjoyed, traveling around, and I guess that's how I ended up in the travel business.
What did you find were like the biggest differences or similarities in like all of these countries that you had lived in?
Differences, there are a lot of differences. I mean, India is its own thing. It's like sometimes I joke that if the rest of the world disappeared tomorrow, I'm not sure the Indians would notice. It's just, there's Indians have their own way of doing everything, and they have
Mhm.
it's not even a culture. It's a civilization. It's a way of life. It's its own thing, and they have their own answer to a variety of cultural questions. So a lot is different in India. Some places, like I lived in Switzerland, in the German part in Schaffhausen. Yeah, I don't know if you've ever been, but it's a nice little hamlet, I guess. It was kind of the opposite of India. So I mean, it was just a
Mhm.
whole other. I think Switzerland is like the diametrical opposite of India in some ways. There were things I loved about Switzerland, but I think I worked better in India, where there were fewer rules. I kept getting
Mm.
into trouble in Switzerland because I did things that I wasn't supposed to, like put out the laundry on Sunday, or
Right.
flush the toilet after a certain hour. I'd get into trouble all the
Yeah, I
time.
can imagine. There's a lot of like rules I sort of have to follow.
Yeah, and I didn't know about it, and I kept getting into trouble all the time. So it was kind of different and strange. And Lithuania, I was there, not long after the Soviet Union fell apart. So it was kind of a
Mm.
country in transition, and so it had its own things. Also, it was part of the Soviet Union, but it had its own identity. All these places were different. You meet people in all these places, and I have friends from all of these places, and that's really what I loved, is that kind of connection that you can make with people, even in very different cultures. I mean, in India, I lived in a small fishing village. I was doing my doctoral dissertation research, and I lived in a village with no electricity or running water, and it was totally fine. I mean, it was about the people I was with,
Mm.
and I enjoyed their company, and we got along well, and that was really what made it. Didn't matter that that there was no electricity, and that I slept on a mat on the ground. Those things didn't really matter. What mattered was
Mm.
the connections that I made with people.
Right. So, but your family came along with you, right, to India?
In the case of India, yeah, I was already married, and we had our eldest, our daughter, whose name is Maya.
Mm.
Um, and so, yeah, we lived in India, all of us, but I set them up in a neighboring town where they had like a nice little house where it was more comfortable than in the village where I would stay for a couple of days a week.
Right.
What happened actually was that when we first arrived in the village, a couple of days after we arrived, a child died of polio.
Mm.
And our daughter at the time was 11 months old and she had no polio vaccinations. And I thought, well, no one should die for social science. It just there was a certain limit, and so she was in the city with my wife, and I was in the village a lot.
Yeah, that sounds like definitely a very unique experience. How do you feel living in Israel now as opposed to like all these other places?
Well, I mean, Israel is different for me in many ways because, first of all, I was born here and I speak the language. And
Hmm.
I grew up, even though I grew up in the United States, I grew up in a very Israeli environment in some ways. What I mean, on the one hand, I lived in the suburbs, of a big American city, and you can imagine what that was like. And I went to, a normal high school with, people who wore varsity jackets and all that kind of stuff. But growing up, it wasn't even that we were in the Jewish community. We were in the Jewish Israeli community. All
Mm.
my parents' friends were Israelis who lived in the Detroit area. And so all the holidays, everything was very Israeli. It was
Hmm.
different than being, an American Jew. It was slightly different. And so coming back to Israel, I would spend my summers here. My grandparents were here. I had cousins here. It felt very familiar. And I came here also out of a certain ideology. I mean, I am a Zionist. I wanted to be here. I felt that it was important for me to be here, but I also wanted my children to grow up in this environment. And
Hmm.
so for Israel, I mean, with all the difficulties, and there are difficulties here, I'm here also from some kind of, ideological reason as well. And so the difficulties, the strangeness is something that I'm willing to work through and overcome. Whereas in other places, sometimes, you go to a place, you don't like it, you move on to the next place.
Right. Yeah, so I guess the sort of adaptation to Israeli life and lifestyle sort of wasn't as alien to you.
That's true, but I have to say that I made Aliyah in essence twice.
Mm.
The first time was when I came here for my undergraduate studies, and that was back in 1988. And I was here for like 6 years almost, a little less. And I left in the end. And part of the reason that I left was because when I came, all my friends here were not Israelis. We would get together and everyone would complain about everything that's wrong with this place and this doesn't work and that doesn't work. And also Israel was a very different country, back in the late 80s, early 90s than it is today.
Hmm.
It's a much more, Western modern country now than what it once was. And even now it, can feel very, quote unquote Oriental at times. But back then it was more so. And this time around, I thought, I'm going to try to really have as many Israeli friends and really integrate more than I did in the past, where I was with all these American friends. Because what would happen is we would get together, and people would do this thing where they would make a list. Today 5 good things happened and 6 bad things happened. And then the next day would be, the opposite. It would be, 6 good things and 5 bad things. And I just decided that being in Israel is like walking in the rain and getting drenched, and then someone throws a bucket of water on you. You can ask yourself, you can get angry and say, well, someone just threw a bucket of water, or you could just accept the fact that you're all wet. And that's the way I kind of live here this time. I mean, I just, I'm already decided to get drenched, so it doesn't matter if someone throws a bucket of water, I'll get through it.
Yeah, that sounds charming. No, but I think it's a good sort of way to look at it, especially if you have to deal with like bureaucratic stuff and all the
Yes,
more
yes. And it
difficult
can be
things.
very bureaucratic, as you know,
Hmm.
I'm
Yeah,
sure.
definitely.
Yeah,
So you've originally studied environmental anthropology and protection. Can you
correct.
tell me what that entails or what that entailed?
Yeah, so, anthropology is the study of cultures. That's pretty clear. Environmental anthropology looks at the relationships between culture and environment. And so, the natural world, the environment shapes culture. It gives it certain limitations to some degree. It's not, black and white. It has kind of a range, but it does shape culture. So, Inuit culture will be different than, cultures in the rainforest because of the environments that they live in. But
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, people in cultures, they shape the environment, and it's kind of, back and forth. I came into this because I used to work in the United States for the Environmental Protection Agency,
Mm-hmm.
and their policy in the Environmental Protection Agency was, that they wanted sound policies, to protect the environment. And so it was kind of a legalistic approach where
Mm-hmm.
everything was, about making laws and enforcing them. And so there was all this kind of talk about law and enforcement in the EPA. And I felt like they didn't really take into consideration the cultural factors that were really important in my mind. So people would go into a meeting, and I worked with fisheries, and people would go into the meeting and say, we need to manage the fish. And I would say, no, you don't need to manage the fish. You need to manage the fishermen.
Mm.
You're not actually managing fish. If you think
Right.
you're managing fish, you're doing the wrong thing. You
Mm.
need to understand the fishermen and their culture. And then they'd say, no, 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 we just need to pass laws, legislation. But if you don't understand the fishermen, they'll find a way around these laws. So, for example, they would pass a law and say, okay, fishermen can only fish 2 weeks a month because they're catching too many fish. What would the fishermen do? They would buy bigger nets so that in those 2 weeks they caught the same amount as they did in a month. And it
Right.
would be this cat and mouse kind of thing instead of sitting down with the fishermen. And so I kind of understood that this isn't the way to really resolve things. It's like the old idea in environmental studies that not man apart. Like we're not apart from nature. Nature defines us and we define it. It's like a back and forth. It's a symbiotic relationship, and it's like a co-evolution. And so
Mm.
that was environmental anthropology. And when I started studying it 20 years ago, it was a very new field. Now it's, most universities offer it, or many universities offer it.
Sounds very interesting. So from there, what made you become a tour guide?
So there were some steps along the way. I
All
mean,
right.
when I graduated with a PhD in environmental anthropology,
Mm-hmm.
I had this opportunity to go back to India and to run a study abroad center. And I really liked it. I really enjoyed doing it because it was like, I could sit in the United States and talk about Indian culture, or I could be in India where you're experiencing it all the time. And every day we could talk about what happened today and what did you see today and and how do we understand this from a
Hands-on
cultural.
approach,
Yeah, it was an
sort of.
immersive. It was like an actual, where the rubber meets the road,
Mm.
uh, experience rather than kind of theoretical. It was more practical.
Mm-hmm.
And so I love doing that. And we used to travel some in India. And so it would be like this educational tourism. And that was kind of, I guess, the gateway drug for me was this educational tourism. When I came to Israel, I worked for a little while also in this kind of educational tourism. But eventually I wanted to go out on, head out on my own. And I really liked the ability of tour guides to kind of go out, do this informal education, and still, in a sense, be your own boss. Like I didn't have to work I work for different tour operators, but I'm also an independent guide. So people can contact me directly. And I'm my own boss in a sense. And I really liked that aspect. I liked that I could do that. And so that's what attracted me to it. It was also, in some ways, brought together all of my interests, culture and history and Zionism and all these things that really matter to me. And so, in that sense, it was kind of like, or presenting my undivided self. And so that was something that I really liked. And the other thing was I had made a decision that I wanted to live in Israel, and studying to be a tour guide in Israel is something that I can only do in Israel. And so it was kind of like
Mm.
a declaration of sorts on my part to say, I'm here to stay because this is what I want to do.
And you can really apply that to another country if you'd move again, right?
I mean, I could apply the elements of the logistical side of things. Like there's a
Hmm.
lot of logistics that go into guiding. And in fact, if you're a good guide, your tourists will never know any of that. It just stays kind of behind the scenes. They don't know what's going on in terms of the hotels and the attractions and the restaurants and all this kind of the buses, all those things. But being an Israeli tour guide is kind of useless anywhere else. I mean, I
Sure.
guess I could bring groups here, I guess, but if I live here, I can do this full time. Being a tour guide is kind of a way for me to say I'm here, like I'm in this place. And I loved the course. I loved the experience, and I love living in a country where there's just so many layers of culture and history and and nature and geology, you name it. It's just a
Mm,
very diverse country. It's such a tiny little place, but extremely diverse.
right. Yeah, definitely. So what are your experiences like with you said you do a lot of like different travel groups, even like different religions, different backgrounds. Was there like any experience that you were surprised by? Maybe where they told you of their perception of a specific thing or anything like that that you were surprised by?
I'd say, in terms of the types of groups that I do the full range of different types of groups, though I don't guide Israelis that often. I do
Hmm.
now because of Corona, there are not many tourists, but in general, I guide what's called incoming tourism, tourists that come from abroad. I do the full range of stuff, whether it's, bar mitzvah, intergenerational family tours, where it's three generations on a bus for a bar or bat mitzvah, or I do, birthright, taglit, Christian pilgrims, mostly from, the Anglosphere, because obviously I'm guiding primarily in English, though I guide in Spanish as well. Most of the groups are like that. I mean, educational is what I really love, and I really do enjoy doing the birthright tours because there is this kind of educational aspect, but also there's this introducing people to Israel. It's like the beginning of a relationship for them with this place, and I find that really special. And so I do those groups.
Were there any sort of maybe I'm mistaken here, but I would imagine that there would be like people who've like for example have never been to Israel before. I would imagine that there would be misconceptions about Israel, like maybe about historical facts or about I don't know, local situation or anything like that. Sort of their ideas that surprised you. Were there any occurrences like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's always a little bit of that. The way that people experience Israel is often mediated by either the media or by, I would say, some kind of a mythology, whether, it's like the Bible, the New Testament, something like that, And
Hmm.
so there are people who come here and on some level they don't even know that they're in Israel. They've come to the Holy Land. They never even actually experience modern Israel in a sense. They go from one church and one, Christian holy site to another. They don't really interact with Israelis that much.
Mm.
And, some of them have even been, surprised that, Jesus was Jewish. I've been surprised that they're surprised, but there is that. And then I've also guided groups that are, like from India, for example, who for them, this is completely a whole other, they don't understand. For them, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam is kind of all the same, the monotheistic religions. They don't really
Mm.
understand why they're fighting and what's the difference and why they don't just all get along. And they're coming from a different frame of reference, completely. Different. It's just a different way of looking at this place. And so sometimes, it's just giving them kind of the basic stuff. And then the media presents this place as, a place of eternal conflict or something like that. And
Hmm.
people are coming here and they're looking for it and they don't always find it. They're looking for conflict and they don't see it like they do on the news because the news, it compresses every time and space into certain events. And so they're
Right.
very surprised when they're here. And they're always asking me the first couple of days, is it safe to go here? Is it safe to do that? All this kind of stuff because they're
Mm.
afraid that something might happen to them. People come with their own baggage when they come here. And my job is to be a broker, to try to
Mhm.
explain the culture to them, to try to get them to see it in a different perspective, to give them some basis without lecturing too much.
Mm. Yeah, but I would imagine that could be sort of difficult, right, at times, because you don't want to be like taking over the teacher role and you do want to convey historical facts and stuff like that, right? So I guess that's kind of a, I don't know,
Yeah,
a thin
it can be
line.
challenging. I mean, I don't usually
Mm,
tell people, you know what, you're wrong. I
right.
say, and the truth is, most people are not very educated about the place. I mean, there are
Mm,
people who are activists, maybe, who are more, educated and more interested in the details than others. But I find that if you scratch the surface even just a little bit, most of them don't know most of the history. They just have this kind of sense about the place from, like I said, the media or the Bible and things like that, and then they come here and they're trying a lot. Most people are also pretty fair-minded and trying to figure out and understand for themselves what it is about this place. And my job is for them, if they have questions, they can come to me. Sometimes, like in, let's say, Birthright, what I'll do is I'll pass around something where they can ask anonymous questions. So they can ask me the most crazy questions that they can imagine. But for the most part, they don't even ask anything that crazy, or that they're not coming here really for political reasons. They're not activists. Most of the people, like, for example, pilgrims that I guide, many of them are pro-Israeli because they're evangelical. But I also just get a lot of people who are workaday people, and that's something that I love. People who've been saving up for years to come here. They want to have an emotional experience, a religious experience. They don't get into all the politics stuff. And I certainly, want them to go back feeling energized from this experience, in a religious sense.
hmm
That's what they're here for.
So I do feel like I have to ask you. I'd actually taken a tour of Jerusalem myself, like a few years ago. There was a supposed like handprint of Jesus at the end of like the Via Dolorosa.
Of the Via Dolorosa, it's where Simon of Cyrene takes the cross from Jesus and helps him carry it part of the way.
It was said that it was supposedly his like Jesus' handprint, right, in the
That's
wall.
that's a traditional belief, yes.
Because that tour guide then like told me the city had been rebuilt several times on top of each other, sort of on top like of the former remains of the city. So that can't possibly be it because Jesus would have had to been a giant or anything like that, you know.
Look, there are tour guides. It depends on the group. Like if you're
Mm-hmm.
taking a group of archaeologists, people who are not religious, skeptical, that you might explain, okay, this, that, or the other about different sites. You can go to a church and you can say, this is, there's two kinds of churches. There are the churches that are built on the site of a miracle, and there are churches that were built on a site where there wasn't a miracle. I have the privilege of going out with people and helping them to experience this place and to go away with an uplifting experience. These are people who have saved for years and they come here. And my job, I don't see it as busting myths. There are tour guides who get it, I don't know, they get some kind of, sick pleasure, like, busting people's myths. And it can be Christians or Jews, right? You can take a Jewish group to Masada and say, this didn't happen and this is just all nonsense. And Josephus is the only source we have and there are no Roman sources and all this stuff. You can do that. I mean, and there is a place for that depending on the group. But what is the point? Like, is are you there to help these people to have some kind of an experience, or are you there to make yourself the center of attention and show everybody how much smarter you are than them? Oh, you believe that Jesus put his hand here, but I know the truth, which is that nothing of the sort happened. But if you're with a group of people for whom that really matters, why would you do that? Like, I would
Mm-hmm.
never do that to a group of people. I mean, that's a local belief that he put his hand, he left his handprint. And for people, often, let's say, like Catholic groups, that's really, something emotional and important to them, to touch a
Mm-hmm.
spot where they believe Jesus touched. I'm not going to, begin to, explain to them, well, that you really couldn't be or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
If that's the local, and people have believed this for a very long time. And again, we could do this with Jewish groups, like, right? You can go to the tomb of King David on Mount Zion, and you can tell people there's no way in the world that this is where the tomb of King David was actually. It's very unlikely that it was there. But on the other hand, there's been a tradition for 2,000 years that that's where it was. So what are you just gonna, sneeze at that tradition and pretend like it doesn't matter? I don't see
Mhm.
that as my role as a tour guide.
I would imagine it could be kind of difficult. Like, what do you sort of convey to people? Is everything based on fact? Is some of it based on like a myth, or is there, or
Look,
is it
if
both
people
of them?
ask me, then I say, that there is historical evidence like this and there is historical evidence like that. We can do this about almost all sites, right? Like, why do they think the King David's tomb is where it is? And you can trot out, these archaeologists say this, those archaeologists say that. And I do that, if people ask me. It's not like I'm not willing to talk about this at all. If people are interested and they want to know what the science behind it is, then I'll tell them. But like every science, there's new discoveries in archaeology all the time. There were periods when people said that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is not the site of, the miracle of the resurrection. And then there are periods where people said, look, we have this information and that information, which
Mm.
leads us to believe that this is likely the place. If someone really wants a fair-minded assessment, you give them all the information. You don't, it's not my job to say, I'm also not an archaeologist, right? My job is to be a guide and to help them to try to work through this and understand. But it's not my place to say, this is the truth, that's not the truth. That's just, not my role as a guide. But at the end, people remember, did they have a good tour or they had a bad tour?
Just recently, there has been a rise of like attacks happening around Jerusalem, which is obviously, I think, because of its vicinity to the West Bank. And there does seem to be sort of an ongoing threat, especially like in Eastern Jerusalem, for Jews. Do you ever feel that it is an unsafe environment for tourists as well, or does that not usually have to concern them?
I think that so many people in Jerusalem depend on tourism and live off of tourism. And if you looked carefully at the people who have been injured or hurt in attacks over the years, I don't know of any case where it was, a tourist that they actually were attacking a tourist. Maybe there was a case where they, misidentified somebody as an Israeli and they attacked them. Having said that,
Hmm.
I mean, Jerusalem and Israel is relatively. You said you lived in Chicago. How many, murders were there in Chicago in the last year? I bring out Chicago because it's not the same size as Israel in terms of population, right?
Yeah, and
Chicago
also for
land.
obvious reasons, in terms of like criminal statistics, right?
Yeah, I mean, but we're even in the height of like, the stabbing intifada that was a couple years ago. I think it was like 30 people got, stabbed. Somewhere around that. 30 people, perhaps 30 people died from stabbing. Compared to like 800 a year in Chicago, it's always, the difference is, again, I bring this back to the media, which is that in the media, it's like looking at the world through a straw. You see like one specific point in time, and that's amplified. And then that becomes, what's associated, and you get bad news every day. The reality is Israel is quite safe, even in terms of like, petty crime. There's not much pickpocketing. There's not much, people aren't being held up in the streets. We have other issues. There could be missiles
Hmm.
that fly into the country from the south or the north. That's for sure. And there's a very real, in my opinion, Iranian threat. It's not like we don't have any security issues, but the day-to-day security, I don't feel. I'm not worried about it when I go around in Jerusalem. And also in Jerusalem, so you go to the Temple Mount or the Holy Sepulchre or the Via Dolorosa or the Western Wall. And most of these places are, have police and they're very well protected. And there isn't really many cases of people being attacked in those places. Tourists tend to be off limits. Like if you go now to the old city, for example, you'll go to the different shops, locals there, they're wondering out loud and dying for people to come back and for tourism to people live off of this. And that's why from the beginning of Corona we thought, okay, tourism will come back because it always does, because Jerusalem is a pilgrimage site for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and it will bring people back. unfortunately, it hasn't happened exactly the way we planned so far.
Yeah, I wonder how long it's going to take. So, I would have to ask you,
Hmm.
so would you think like locals, like Jewish Israeli locals from like cities other than Jerusalem, if they want to go and visit Jerusalem, would they best disguise as a tourist to go to Jerusalem to be on the safer side, you think? If there is
No,
such a thing as a
I really
disguise?
don't think so. Look, there are neighborhoods in Jerusalem where you might feel less comfortable, like on the, I don't know, a tour neighborhood, which is, Mount of Olives, which I go to all the time with tourists. But in the old city of Jerusalem and in West Jerusalem and most parts of Jerusalem where Israelis would go, certainly you'd never need to disguise. And this is something which I've been kind of shocked by. I think in some ways Israelis are more scared than tourists, maybe because they see the media here, cover every single event. But I've seen this even with my kids' school, where they had to like debate whether they should go to Jerusalem or not. Is it safe for the kids? And
Mm,
I don't understand it because I go there, I live in Haifa, but on a normal week, I'm in Jerusalem 3 days a week because, I have a group that I go, would go with and take to Jerusalem. And I've been everywhere in Jerusalem, and I'm including even, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, I was in Shoafat, which is a refugee camp, and I never had any issues. And usually people are quite happy, to have even Israelis. And now, if you walk around the old city, they're extremely happy to have Israelis. And Israelis are all over the old city in a way that I haven't seen before because the locals, want this kind of, the currency, the money. They need people to come in and shop in the shops that used to be just for tourists. So I don't think you should dress differently. We need to be self-confident enough in our own country to be able to walk around.
right. Yeah, we should.
Yeah,
What do you personally think people, let's say on a global scale, should know about Israel, like to begin to understand the situation here better? Because I think there's a lot of false information, there's a lot of misinformation and lack of information too.
there's a lot of virtue signaling and there's a lot of, just it's just this constant drip of bad news. And then, you're kind of asked to choose sides. It used to be like, I remember in the old days, you would, ask somebody about global warming or I don't know what, gun control or vegetarianism and abortion or anything, any topic that you might ask. And they would have an opinion on this, that, or the other. Today, it's like if you know one opinion, you kind of know all of them. They all kind of fall into this line. So, like, if you feel this way about, gun control, then I can pretty much guess where you are on the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Hmm.
And, depending on which side you are on the issue, there's this polarization that's happened over the years. And part of it is because of social media and these kind of like loyalty oaths that you have to make in front of, your friends whenever there's something you have to put out some kind of, hashtag something something that you're in favor or against something. And so I think that's different than what it used to be. It used to be a little bit more nuanced, and I think all these podcasts are helping in some way to make the conversation more nuanced. If you
Hmm.
ask me what people should know, I often start with I tell people, we have here a minority that feels like a majority, and we have a majority that feels like a minority. And as a result, it's very hard sometimes to see eye to eye. What do I mean by that? The Arabs in Israel are a minority, but because they're connected to the Arab world and to the Islamic world, from their perspective, they are the majority, and they're much bigger and stronger, and so they shouldn't actually have to make any concessions on anything here, because if they make any concessions today, it's like they're cheating their grandkids. Why should they do it now when eventually they're going to get everything? They are a minority, but they feel on some level that the ones here are part of a larger majority, and so they don't need to actually compromise. On the other hand, the Jews living in Israel feel like we're a majority on the one hand. 75% of the population here is Jewish, but we're a minority in our region, and we're afraid to make any concessions because we're a minority and we could be overwhelmed, and look what happened in Gaza, and we have all the the PTSD from the Holocaust, and we don't want to be tricked again. And so it creates this kind of situation where you have these two groups that have to reach some kind of an agreement, because at the end of the day we have to live together. And unfortunately, because we're coming from two different perspectives, it makes it hard to find a medium between the two groups, just based on that alone.
Yeah, it sure feels like there's many people sort of going into it with an iron fist into like any sort of conflict resolution process, but then standing their ground because they don't want to give up and, as you said, make any concessions. Can I ask you, what do you mean by children eventually, or like grandchildren? I think you said they are eventually going to get everything. Do you think because they're going to be more liberated, they're eventually going to want to have the Israeli passport? Because I know that there's many who like originally refused to have an Israeli passport and now have no passport because they refused simply
No,
out of
what I meant is that they're playing a long game. This isn't about 1967, 1948. It's about this long game about the Arab, from a kind of an Arab Muslim perspective. Israel is kind of an anomaly. It shouldn't be here in from their perspective. It's like the Crusaders shouldn't have been here. The Crusaders were here for almost 200 years, and eventually they were kicked out and they're no longer here. And from the perspective of, and I'm not saying all Arabs are like this, and I should add that it's really not my place to speak, in the name of Arabs. I'm kind of generalizing here. Like it's not like I'm a spokesperson for the Palestinian, cause in any way. And so, but in general, what I meant by that was that if they make any concessions today, and Arafat even said this, that any concessions would be at the expense of their grandchildren in 20 or 50 years from now. And so better not to make any concessions and to have maximalist goals. Or what some of them argue is that they need to do this kind of, sausage technique where, they every time they slough off a little bit more until eventually they get the whole, the whole pie, the whole sausage or something like that. I'm not saying that everybody, again, thinks that way, but there is certainly an element in Palestinian society which sees it that way. One of the symbols of Israel is the sabra plant, right? This cactus, the opuntia cactus. For Jews, if you're born in Israel, you're called a sabra, and it has to do with this idea that is prickly on the outside but sweet on the inside. And so Israelis can come off as very prickly at times, but if you just, get down to to the core, you'll see that they're very sweet. The same plant is actually also symbolic for Palestinians, but it symbolizes sumud. Sumud is like this idea of steadfastness, of rootedness to the land, of being prickly and not being able to be removed so easily, staying here and not giving up anything. And so the same thing has very different, kind of meanings for both communities. And I think it says something about, the goals here.
Yeah, that's fascinating, actually.
One of the things that I would say that for me, which is sad, is that unfortunately, most of the peace initiatives that go on are top down. They're from, people sitting in offices, talking to each other and, deciding, let's do this, let's do that. There's not much going on from bottom up, and it isn't going on for a variety of reasons. Again, there's, a lot of fear in the Jewish community, but there's also this idea of anti-normalization in the Palestinian community. It makes it hard for people-to-people contacts to happen. And that's sad, because I think for this ever to be resolved, we're going to have to go from bottom up and not from top down.
Sure. Like any revolution starts, right?
Yeah.
There does seem to be a sort of a change that can be noticed. I think within the West Bank, which is the place that, like, I would say, super extreme anti-Israel Palestinians usually like to refer to as Palestine, I'm guessing. So in the West Bank, I do feel that there is sort of a wind of change kind of coming up. Like especially young people now, especially around places like Ramallah and all of these very concentrated places of, extreme ideology and everything. Do you feel that is happening, or is that just sort of something that flames up and then eventually goes away and disappears again?
Yeah, I honestly, couldn't really honestly tell you because I don't go to those places very often, right? I've been to
Hmm.
Ramallah a couple times. I've been to Rawabi. I'm going to be in Bethlehem in this week. I'm going to be in Bethlehem. So I get to some of these places. I go to Jericho sometimes, but I don't have a feel for the West Bank. I don't know because our societies are quite separate, right? We live very
Hmm.
separate existences. One of the things that I tell people about Israel is that America, people come here, wherever you go, there you are, right? You never can escape yourself and your own kind of paradigms for understanding reality. Americans, for example, they come here and they're used to this idea of multiculturalism, and they're used to this idea of America as this, melting pot where eventually everybody, maintains some elements of their heritage, but are Americans at the end of the day. Israel is not that. That's not the example of Israel. Israel is more like an Indian thali plate where we're all on one plate, but each one is in their own little, containers, right? Where it's a bunch of little, saucers on this one bigger plate.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
there's
it
not a
doesn't
lot
come
of
together
contact.
as one, right?
Yeah, it doesn't, and that goes across many different divides, not only, Jew and Arab or, Jew and Muslim or whatever. Is it could be between religious Jews and non-religious Jews. There's also, class divides, and there's Sephardi and Ashkenazi. There's all these different ways that our society is divided in some sense.
Very
Uh,
much so, yeah.
yeah, that it's hard for me to really know, but I do think that there is some sense that there's a little bit of, like, reason to hope. On the other hand, in this past May, we had these, riots in Jaffa and Lod and Akko, and for me, that was worse than the missiles. I mean, it was more, not that it was frightening, it was just so discouraging, right? I'm still not
Mhm.
sure I know why that happened entirely, but I was in Akko that day, a couple hours before the rioting started, and the places got burned down, and you could feel something in the air. It was very intense. Someone died in the end. It was a very intense experience. And so, yeah, I hear that there's this change, but how real is it? I don't know.
I think that was following the missiles that were fired from Gaza to Israel, right? That's when the riots started.
Yeah,
And
but
I
it
feel
was
like that
riots
was,
between neighbors, Jews and Arabs.
yeah, but
The,
wasn't that maybe sort of a sign of solidarity from Arabs living in Israel as Israelis, Arab Israelis? Sort of a sign of solidarity from them to Gaza,
Well,
don't you
that's a
think?
great question, and that's something that what I meant, and when I said I don't really know for sure what went on here. I mean, even to now, I don't know. Like, that's one possible response. Okay, so they see themselves as Palestinians, and so they're rioting because of what's happening in Gaza and what's going on. That's possible. I actually don't really think that that's what happened. I mean, personally, it may be, but I don't think that's what happened. I
Mm.
think what happened is that there's all this pent up anger at a lot of things that are going on in the Arab community, and a sense of being second class citizens and being sidelined, that it came out at that point for a variety of reasons, but not because of Gaza. That was just when it all came to a boil. But maybe I'm wrong. I mean, that's the thing.
Mm.
Like I said, and even as a tour guide, I try to get people, to talk to other people, but for the most part, we go from one attraction to another. I go to work with a list of places that I need to see on a particular day. I usually don't build, the tours. It's either through the tour operator or the tourist, requests certain things. I try here and there to, through my commentary, or if I can get them to another place that I know that is good. But for the most part, it's not like you're sitting down with a group of 40 people and you just show up at someone's house and get to sit and have tea with them. It just doesn't happen.
And there's also only like so much you can do, there's only so much you can tell them. Like I think to explain the entire history and why this whole like sort of ongoing conflict is as complex as it is Well, a huge thing to take on, I think, right?
Well, I mean, usually I have people for 10 days or for a week.
Mm,
And so we can get into some of those elements. And there are people who this is what they do. I mean, you can hire people. There's a whole industry of people whose job is to teach about the conflict or to show up and be partisans for their side. So there's numerous Palestinian families who make a living or used to make a living off of meeting tour buses and explaining why, the Palestinian perspective of the conflict. And you
mm,
have also some Jewish organizations that will do this as well. So you have this, but you don't really get to meet the man on the street, this kind of thing. It's all very structured. And
right.
for the most part, people come here on tours, even though, by the way, like individual travelers, the number is going up and up every year. But the cost of living here is so high that it's hard for individual travelers to travel here unless they have a lot of money.
Coming to the next part, I'm sure you've been heavily impacted by the many, many lockdowns we've had here in Israel. How did you, or how do you still keep busy during that time? Do you get any compensation from the government? Have you been able to sort of shift your knowledge into another field for the moment?
So, yeah, this has been extremely, extremely challenging. Tourism, we all know this. Everyone who works in tourism, especially in Israel, knows that tourism can be very fickle, that sometimes, there are good years and there are bad years and there are things that happen. And this happens anywhere, right? If there's a terrorist attack in Paris, then there's going to be, cancellations. People cancel tours because of things like this. After
Hmm.
9/11 in the US, people didn't travel for several years. The numbers didn't go back up to what it was before. And in Israel, we have, every couple years, we have something with, the Gaza Strip, or we have a terrorist attack or something of the sort. And so going into this business, you know that you need to always put aside money for the lean periods, right? You have
Hmm.
to, when you are making money, put it aside, because there are going to be periods when you're not going to be making money. But what's happened here is completely unprecedented. Never has it been this bad. Even in the second Intifada, where it was several years of bombings, there was still a trickle of tourism.
Hmm.
It was never a situation like here where March 15th, 2020, the skies closed for any foreigners who wanted to visit Israel, and they reopened only on the 1st of November 2021.
Right,
And
and
then
then they closed again a few days ago, right?
yeah, and then a week ago they closed. So like after
Hmm.
a couple of weeks, 4 weeks, they closed the skies again. I had a group coming in a couple of days. I mean, like 10 days, and they had to cancel because they were, the skies are closed. They don't know if they'll be able to get in, and
Mm.
so it's just impossible to survive this way long term. In terms of the government, yeah, I mean, like everybody else who lost jobs because of Corona or were put on furlough because of Corona, I received, a percentage of my previous earnings. So it was like
Mm.
70% of whatever I earned before, I got as like unemployment. And
Mm.
I also got grants on a couple occasions because as a tour guide, I'm also like an independent contractor. So I got some money and I was fine for the first year, even for the first year and a half when we had all this stuff. But since the summer, they've cut off the unemployment for most guides. I'm over the age of 50, so I had it for a couple more months. But at the moment, I don't get almost anything. I get just a very, very basic amount of money, which is because I still can't work. And the government hasn't given us any compensation for what they just did now. For example, they say we could find alternative employment. And so, unfortunately, I don't know how much longer I'll be able to survive. I have, I had over the past summer, I had 80 days in my calendar, all of which were canceled. I had 20 days now in December, 10 of which are already canceled, and I'm waiting to see what will happen to the other 10. Will they open the skies or not? And I have to, make a decision. I love being a guide. And I really enjoy it, and I think I'm good at it. But I can't continue like this, and so I don't know what's going to happen. I may leave tourism for a while and wait and see what happens next.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's what you see happening a lot, like people having to leave their industry because that specific field of work is just not adaptable to make it digital. Do you think that these like financial cuts, if we can call it that, have been due to the new government? Because it does seem to coincide date-wise.
The finance ministry has not been interested in our plight. They've been completely closed off to tour guides and tour guide organizations that have tried to meet with them. There's been very little support. And the perspective, I think, has something to do with this kind of approach of like, it's a free market, neoliberal capitalism. Just everyone should just, figure it out. Um, my problem with that is that on the one hand, they're telling us the skies are going to open, and so I want to work in the profession that I'm good at, and that I, that I have a name, that I've built a name, that I can make money in, that I know what I'm doing.
Mm.
And so I see this cookie in the distance, a mirage that I go for, and then they pull it away at the last minute. Like, I mean, I don't have any control of it, and that's a problem. And that's something that I've been thinking a lot about. That I don't, should I be in a position where, the decisions aren't really in my hands anymore? If you really want to be open and neoliberal and everyone figure it out, then fine. Then open up the skies and let everything, let the chips fall as they may. But if not, then you need to take ownership and be responsible for our situation, because it's not that I don't want to work, and my guide friends also, we all want to work. In fact, we would
Mm.
love to work more than anything, but if we can't work if the skies are closed and tourism, isn't allowed to occur as a result.
Yeah, of course.
So that's really been, the problem. Is it the new government? I don't think the last government, we've had what, 4 governments in a couple of years. The problem was that every time they changed the minister of tourism, right? The last one, she was actually
Mhm.
quite good. The one before was not good at all. He left already to the US. He wasn't interested. The one we have now is like a very good at judo, but I don't think he knows anything about tourism. We don't hear much from him. He promised that there would be compensation. So far, there's been none.
Wow.
So yeah, there's I haven't really seen anything come out of his tenure, and it's become this kind of position that nobody wants, right? Nobody wants to be minister of tourism during the Corona era. It's just
Mm.
a headache. And so yeah, nothing's happening really in reality in terms of the industry.
Mm. Like, do you consider taking more locals on tours?
That 70% of tourism was incoming before the Corona, right? So
Mhm.
only 30% of tour guides worked with locals. Now, being a local tour guide is very different than being an incoming tour guide. It's not the same profession. It's actually a different profession. I mean, the tours that I did, I thought about it. Like, I would guide people, local people. So already it's different. Like, the expectations that Israelis have of tour guides are very different than the expectations that someone from the outside has, right? Israelis, they're familiar with this place. And also, they have experiences with a lot of these places. So they want to share their experiences. And oftentimes Israelis, they don't want to go for like an education. They don't want someone to explain things to them. They want someone to entertain them. And so you need to be a certain
Mm.
kind of personality. And my Hebrew is quite good, but not everybody's Hebrew is quite good. And even I joke, that I'm 30% less funny in Hebrew. It's just, I'm more comfortable in English. So there's that. And then the sites that we go to, Israelis don't go to the sites that foreigners go to. There's no overlap. So you have to learn a whole new body of, places. And then the companies are different. The tour operators are very different. So you got to find your way into those companies. And the attractions are different, the food is different, everything is different. So it's like learning a whole other profession. And at the end of the day, there's just not enough spots for everybody in that profession. So many people who are working, right? So now maybe for a 10-day period of Hanukkah, there's work. And then after that, there's very little. Whereas tourism, there are some slow months, but most of the year you have work. So it's very different to work as Israeli. The other thing that I would say is I'm obviously prejudiced here, and I think that tour guiding is important, but I think that we're kind of ambassadors for this country in many ways. People come to Israel, and this is a country which is very misunderstood. And we do very important work helping people to experience this place in a positive way. And I think that there's a national interest. I mean, not anybody can be a guide. In order to be a guide, you have to have a license. To get a license, you study 2.5 years, hundreds of class hours. You have to go through examinations. Every year, you have to renew your license. You have to do, workshops and trainings every year. It's a very regulated industry. And then as soon as, we're in need, it feels like, we were abandoned. It's depressing for us a little bit, I think, as tour guides, the situation, because, no one gets rich being a tour guide. You live fine, but no, you don't get rich. It's a profession where it's a certain calling, and it's an important one, in my opinion. And if you ask tourists who visit Israel, whenever they have asked tourists, and every year the Ministry of Tourism asks them to rate and rank the things that they experienced here. So it would be like, the hotels, the restaurants, the attractions. Number one always on the list is tour guides. Like we always get the highest ranking of anything else in the country that people experience when they're traveling here. And so, we've been doing our job. We've been doing it faithfully. And now when the situation is, the government decides to close the skies, we were hoping, we were expecting some kind of understanding and some kind of support.
I do understand with the Omicron variant, there had to be like measures taken fast, which a lot of countries have done. But then, yeah, I think you do need to support the people within your country. And it's devastating to hear those stories, really.
Yeah, and,
So,
and I really don't know when we'll move past this. Again, I agree that you have to listen to, the advice of the experts when it comes to health. Once that decision was made, then there's a certain obligation that you have. It's not like, this is what's going to break the bank. And all I want, like I just lost 10 days of work because of this. Then compensate me, if not for the entire 10 days, then for some of it. But there's no talk of anything like that.
apparently, Prime Minister Bennett saying that he will do everything differently from Netanyahu. Like saying that so publicly, you sort of have to stick to it. And then if he wants to avoid another lockdown, which for you personally, I think doesn't really make much of a difference, like with your job, right? Whether you're in lockdown or you can go outside, but you just don't have really any visitors, then yeah, I think that's
I've
doesn't help the
basically been in
situation.
lockdown every month since March, except for the couple weeks in November when the skies
Mm.
were open. I've been in lockdown, and people in my industry, and that includes tour operators and hotels that work with foreigners and restaurants that depend on foreigners and the, shops. All of us have basically been on lockdown since, this all started, except for a couple weeks, and it didn't have a chance even to pick up before it got closed again. And I agree
Mm.
that, he staked a very, extreme position, which was that, there were going to be no more lockdowns. But he also said that his government would be different, and that, rules that were given to the common people would be the same rules that he expects his government to follow. And at the same time, his wife and kids are vacationing abroad. And
I heard, yeah.
it's like he tells people don't travel because we don't want to bring this variant back. But his own family is, out and traveling and doing their thing. We saw this in the Netanyahu's government when Rivlin, had his daughter over for Passover, or Litzman went to pray in a synagogue at time and got sick from corona at a time when no one was supposed to be praying, in closed spaces, all this kind of stuff. And here we have it again. And also, we had tourists over the summer a little bit, and we had tourists now tested and checked several times here and there. And why I don't understand why Israelis can't bring this variant in. In fact, that's exactly what happened. And it's what happened with Delta. So what are we accomplishing here? Yeah, I don't know how it's going to succeed, but let's
Mm.
say, that I'm not an expert on this, and granted, then I should get some kind of financial compensation. But that doesn't seem to be anything that's going to be on the horizon anytime soon. And I'm asking myself whether I should continue. And again, I love doing this job. And in fact, if I may give myself a plug here, I even have a podcast where I interview other tour guides. It was something that I wanted to do so that,
Mm.
we would have a voice in some way. And also as an oral history, as a way to kind of document what's going on. Ironic if I end up, putting up my hat. I'm kind of very invested in this industry, and I love it. And so I really don't want to. I've really been resisting it. At the moment, I don't know what I'm going to do, because at the end of the day, I need to earn money, and at the moment, I'm not.
Yeah, I understand. Well, let's hope for the best and that eventually we'll figure out either another vaccine with an additional component covering, I don't know, new mutations. And yeah, that will eventually find a way for people to be able to live with this like pandemic, I guess, for the next few
Mhm.
years at least. So, speaking of your podcast, it's called Tour Guide Confidential, right?
Correct. Yeah, Tour Guide Confidential.
And it is only tailored for listeners that are tour guides themselves, or also for other listeners who are interested in historical facts and.
We talk
Mhm.
about what goes on behind the scenes. We talk about the different aspects of guiding, and so it is more for tour guides. But I think that if people listen to it, they might find it interesting from an educational, like if you're interested in education, in formal education, that kind of thing.
It sounds interesting. Yeah. Where can people find your podcast?
At tourguideconfidential.com.
Oh,
One word,
perfect.
tourguideconfidential.com. And we also talk about what it's like to guide the conflict in Israel, guiding different cultures, and our role as tour guides in doing that, all kinds of things which have to do with guiding, but I think that they have applications in other places, as well as telling their story about what's going on in Israel during this period.
Great.
Anybody can contact me. I do all kinds of groups, and if it's larger groups, I also work with very reputable tour operators who will do all the logistics, and drop me a line and be in touch, and I'll be happy to help you plan something for Israel.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being on this episode, Eyal. It was a
Thank you
pleasure
so much,
talking to
man. I
you.
really appreciate it.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Upfront Podcast. We will be back next week.